world, welcome to the Casual Historian Podcast. My name is Grant, and this is my co-host James.
Hello, everyone.
This is the podcast where two history buffs talk about the things that they don't get to talk about in their history classes. And today, I believe, James, you have the topic for us.
Yes, today's topic is the age-old question of East versus West. This is a question that could literally span an entire course's worth of time. Mostly because, we often hear the terms East versus West. We talk about Western civilization, and there's not necessarily the clearest consensus on what constitutes West or East. So today we're just kind of going to explore some of the historical context for what does constitute East versus West, and this won't come as a surprise to most of you, but, the notion of what is East and what is West has changed over time.
The oldest definition would be just sort of Christendom as being West. At least the post-Roman West is Christendom.
Well, I think that's a very good place to start. Rome is probably the first place where we really get clear sense of the idea of an East versus West. And I'm not even going to lead with, the partition of the empire between East and West. I'm going to go back earlier than that. Rome's big geopolitical rival was Persia, the Parthian Empire specifically. And so in some ways, you could look at Rome collectively as being a Western civilization versus a Persian Eastern civilization. And that could even go back even further, to the days of the Persian Empire and its opposition to the Greek city-states. Mm-hmm. Of course, there is another interpretation in which, one that I share, which would actually put Persia in an early Western civilization as well, in that Persia influences Western civilization in a significant way. It's very hard to understand the history of Christianity and of Judaism without understanding the role that Persia plays in shaping them, both in a real political sense and then also religiously, in terms of the interaction and contact between Zoroastrianism and both Judaism and early Christianity. I would actually kind of say that in terms of the ancient world, the real boundary between East and West would be fixed at the Indus River in what's now Pakistan. And the reason why is that, you have this kind of common approach, a common philosophy, history, the Mediterranean world, and a common history, religion, philosophy of the Indian subcontinent. Persia kind of has feet in both realms, but in neither. And so, over time, that boundary does shift westward. So then we do get to Rome. Mm-hmm. You have its rivalry with Persia. The common frontier between those two was the Euphrates River. But then moving a little bit further in Roman history, we get to Diocletian, who begins the process of, splitting the empire among, multiple emperors, which lays a foundation for eventually the permanent break between the West and Eastern empires, the West being Italy, Spain, Northern Africa, France, and Britain, the East including most of the Balkans, Anatolia, Egypt, and Syria.
I had never thought of Persia in any way being Western. I guess this mostly comes from its contemporary Western-centric mindset about it. I hold sort of the more Huntington view of it, which I don't want to get too much into Huntington because we want to talk about that in a later episode. His idea that the Western civilization really was birthed at the sort of collapse of the Roman Empire, and you had the Eastern and the Western Empire forming their own civilizations. Like before then, and they were sort of one civilization. Like the Western civilization hasn't always existed. Rather, it was built on the ruins of a previous civilization, which is built on the ruins of another one, which may have been combined from two others, so on and so forth.
Well, I think that, there's something to be said for that, but I would disagree on parts of it. But Western civilization, and by extension, whatever Eastern civilization might be, because even these terms are very Western-centric when you think about it. With Western civilization, comprising really a set of civilizations. It's really a civilization grouping, a family of civilizations. Even in Roman times, the more affluent and developed parts of the Roman Empire are in its eastern areas. You have the Hellenistic cities of Alexandria and Antioch in the east. You have the ancient civilizations of Greece, the Anatolians, Syrians, and Egyptians, long-standing ancient civilizations older than Rome itself. And then on the western side of the extremity, you have Rome, you have the Carthaginian remnants in North Africa and Spain, you have Celts in Gaul and Britain. And so what you have is this kind of grouping of civilizations that comprises Western or Roman civilization. And that does kind of persist because after the schism, you have, a much more vibrant and viable Eastern Empire because it has these, economic and infrastructure development over centuries, the western part of the empire is much more underdeveloped. It's younger. It's more culturally sparse in terms of development, and it's also much more susceptible to invasion. So you have, the giving way of, Roman and Celtic cultures in the west in favor of Germanic, Lombards, Franks, and Saxons. But, we do kind of get this really clear sense of a west-east dichotomy after the Western Roman Empire falls. Because one thing that's important to remember is that until the Western Empire falls, whether you date it with Romulus Augustus being deposed or Julius Odoacer being deposed, Julius Nepos being deposed by Odoacer, the idea was that there was still really only one Roman Empire. It just had two emperors, but the empire was always still one. After the Western Empire falls, you get this really clear sense of a dichotomy between the East at the time, which would be, the what's now called the Byzantine Empire historically, what they call themselves still just the Roman Empire, and the various tribes taking over, Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Franks in Gaul, and Saxons in northern Germany and in Britain, that as they do begin to, settle and create and develop their own civilizations, are constantly at odds with the Romans or the Byzantines. You have still this effort by Justinian to try to reclaim western parts, doesn't really take hold all that well except in Italy, because the new entry onto the scene in the East versus West rivalry to happen is, of course, Islam. Islam and the Caliphate and its successors will be the big geopolitical rivals for Europe collectively for the next millennium, for the most part. But I think it's worth noting that, and one thing why I did earlier mention the Indus River as an early boundary, is that there is an argument to be made that collectively Western civilization can be described as the civilizations which over time adopt one of the Abrahamic faiths, which would include, of course, Judaism, Christianity, and in fact Islam. And in fact, the early Islamic Caliphate saw itself as being within that tradition, and you see this adherence to things like Greek philosophy and Persian art and architecture, which is something that really hadn't really been explored since the days of Alexander.
Definitely very differently than what I usually thought of. Samuel P. Huntington definitely influenced my view of what civilization is. It changed the idea of looking at civilization from being sort of like one that's based on technological development, a more like a Epic of Gilgamesh type of civilization dichotomy versus one that's more cultural, which is what I tend to look at, the more cultural one. And I use the more the Western-centric one, is that the Islamic world is as a separate civilization rather than it being just a subpart of Western civilization. In fact, for me anyways, Western civilization has been Western Christendom. You have basically the Catholics and the Protestant lands making primarily up of what is Western civilization. Of course, what makes these definitions messy is that you get these occasional exceptions, or well, not occasional, very frequent exceptions from many different places, like Poland. It's a Catholic country, but is it Western civilization or Eastern civilization?
Well, because then you run into the question of, is it just religion? Because ethnicity then becomes a question. Poland is a Slavic country, as is Bohemia, the Czechs. Do they qualify as being Western or Eastern? But, you do make a good point about religion in a certain way, because, of course, Islam is, even in my definition, where I would classify it as being part of the Western family, I would put it at the periphery in that respect. But in 1054, we do have, the Great Schism, which, for those of you who don't know, is this really interesting hissy fit thrown between the papacy and the leaders of the Eastern Orthodox churches, which results in a Great Schism, in which has now become, at the time, kind of seen as just an incident that might have been brushed over eventually, has become one of the defining shapers of our history, because it represents a permanent break in Christendom between, the areas that follow or acknowledge the supremacy of the pontiff in Rome and the more collegial style of the Eastern patriarchs. But what's interesting about this is that, in the East, that includes groups like, obviously, the Greeks, eventually the Slavs, for the most part, exceptions being the Croats, the Poles, and the Czechs, as well as Georgians, Armenians, and Christian Arabs that fall into that category. But it's worth noting that civilizationally speaking, by the 1500s, most of the territories that are primarily inhabited by Eastern Orthodox peoples are at some point conquered and occupied by Muslims. Obviously, the fall of the Byzantine Empire to the Ottomans is the clearest example of that, and the subsequent occupation of Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria by the Ottomans, but also the Muslim Mongols in Russia in the 13th century, who are not thrown off by the Russian principalities until also the 1500s. But, we do have this sense of an East versus West tension in which, the question is, are the Orthodox Slavs and Hellenic peoples truly Eastern? Because probably we wouldn't necessarily group them as being in the exact same category as Islamic Arabia or Persia, but they're certainly not quite on the same cultural or civilizational wavelength as Western Europe at this time, because one of the things as well is that Western Europe is becoming increasingly feudal, whereas the Orthodox civilizations of the East are generally occupied territories increasingly.
I would say the solution to that, at least the one that probably most more conservative historians looking at civilization define it as Western civilization as Western Christendom, the Catholic and Protestant lands. For the most part, you get your one-off exceptions like Poland. And then you have the Islamic civilization, but then the Orthodox lands form their own Orthodox civilization. At least that's the one I have seen most often used.
Yes, there is also a term that's sometimes used, which is called the Byzantine Commonwealth, which is the idea that not only the Byzantine Empire, but also territories that took their civilizational cues from them, like the Serbs, the Bulgarians, and later on the Russians. But going back to the notion of Rome as being central to the notion of Western and Eastern civilization, is that one of the earlier points of tension, which I failed to point out, is when the popes crown the Holy Roman Emperors, when they create Charlemagne's empire and later on Otto's empire, it creates a great deal of tension with Constantinople, because they still consider themselves to be not the successors of Rome. They consider themselves to be Rome. And they're like, and who are these Frankish or German upstarts who are now calling themselves Roman emperors as well? And why is the Pope helping them? He's supposed to be on our side. But, that now we're increasingly in this geopolitical tension, the idea of fixed groups, which is part of this. One of the other tensions of East and West is a Latin West versus a Greek East, where in the West, Latin has become the culture of trade, of civilization, because, it was the only constant language over time as, dialects emerge, die out, or move, whereas Greek becomes the foundational language of the East, eventually, of course, superseded to an extent by Slavonic, which will lead to the great Slavic power and probably the center of what most people think of as the East versus West rivalry, Russia.
Yeah, Russia definitely does, at least modern Russia, doesn't see itself as Western. I know Putin likes to think of him as leading, the East, being the leader of the East. And he often uses language, East and West as well. And I guess that's one of the complaints I often hear about using terms like Eastern and Western civilization, because the biggest complaint is geography. It's like the world is a globe. If you go far enough west, you get to where we think of as being East. But I think if we're going to make this any bit easy to talk about, you have to confirm that when we're using East and West, we're going to use the Afro-Eurasian landmass as defining what we're going to use for East and West, where the western half is going to be West, the eastern half is going to be East. Assuming, ignoring the existence of the Americas, which, Europe did until about 600 years ago.
Yeah, well, and also that's a pretty solid starting point. And it's important to note that by the time we get to about the 1600s, you can kind of describe a boundary between East and West that fluctuates. You have a hard western boundary, the eastern boundary for the West, which would be what's now the border, the eastern borders of Slovenia, Austria, the Czech Republic, and runs through Poland. And you have an Orthodox boundary, which is kind of shifting over time, but would eventually include all of what's now Russia and most of what's now Ukraine and Belarus. And then you have Ottoman civilization, which is the latest iteration of an Islamic caliphate, includes most of the Balkans, pretty much at the boundary of what's now Bosnia and Croatia. And everything in the middle shifts back and forth over time. We have Ottomans conquering most of Hungary at one point, then being driven back. You have Russians slowly advancing westward bit by bit. But, it's important to note that Russia's position is very complicated because Russia itself sees itself, and in some ways is, a successor to three civilizations. they called Moscow the Third Rome. That's not merely just a religious assertion about the Russian Orthodox Church. It also reflects its heritage. It takes its cue as seeing itself a successor to the Byzantine emperors, who were themselves a continuation of Rome, but they are also very much shaped by the steppe Khans, the Mongol Golden Horde, in which the Tsar is not only a Basileus or a Caesar, but he's also a Khan. And in fact, if you read some Russian texts, proclamations in which his full grand style is used, you'll see, Tsar of all the Russias, but you'll also see things like Khan of Kazan or Khan of Siberia, is suggesting this distinct civilization from the West, which is increasingly feudal. Monarchies are much more limited in their power, except in France after the Fronde. But Russia has historically tended to reflect a strong central leader, an autocrat, which is actually a title used by the Tsars until 1917. But it is interesting to note, though, that Peter the Great, the great reforming Tsar, he did see Russia as being outside of Western civilization and wanted to make it more Western. The city that bears his name, St. Petersburg, was designed to be a window on the West, and that he wanted to adopt more trappings of Western civilization. The thing is that he was more interested in the outward styles, architecture, fashion, and whatnot. Not so much in terms of, the idea of limited monarchy or representative governments that were gradually taking hold in the form of, noble assemblies in France and in Great Britain, or the Diets of the Holy Roman Empire.
Well, in his defense, that era was sort of, you're seeing more along the lines of enlightened despotism, at least in the East. It's
still a little early for that, because and it's more to know that Russia doesn't experience the Enlightenment in the way the West does. Because the Enlightenment itself is kind of a product of Reformation and Counter-Reformation tensions. Russia experienced none of those things, not being within Catholic family of religions. But what I will say, though, is as Russia does increasingly reach great power status and has an influence in Europe, its rulers are anxious to see themselves as integrated and involved as European powers. And increasingly, European powers over time do see them as such. From about maybe the 1600s through to about the 19th century, the notion of an East versus West tension is increasingly moot, because colonization is calling attention for, France, the United, or Britain and Spain and Portugal elsewhere. Italy is gradually declining from its Renaissance glory. The Germans are still gradually sussing out a national identity, and the Ottomans are decaying. And then, at the end of the 18th century, you have the specter of revolution, in which Russia will play a crucial role in defeating Napoleon. So during the 19th century, you have this kind of sense that Russia is indeed a European power in the same sense that France and Britain are.
I guess we could say this identity that is Europe is sort of an overlapping identity of what is Western civilization. While you could say you have West as in Western Christendom and the Orthodox or Eastern Christendom, Europe just would seem to be, at least in the context of the 19th century, this overlapping layer of what they all are. It's like, yes, there's East and West, but there's also European, which is all of us sort of together, but not.
You're absolutely right. When you look at things like the Serb and Greek revolutions against Ottoman rule in the first half of the 19th century, you have support, obviously from Russia, understandably, because the Serbs and Greeks are Orthodox like the Russians, but they also get a great deal of sympathy and support from people in Britain and in France, because they're seen as being Christian as well. Even though they're a different kind, the denomination does not seem to matter so much in their estimation of sympathy. For Austria, they see it as a means to help weaken an age-old geopolitical rival in the Ottoman Empire. And so when Greece and Serbia do become independent, Serbia is actually a constitutional monarchy on independence in a very Western sense of the word. Greece would firmly be in the Western sphere, even though it is not Latin in culture or Germanic, and it's Orthodox in religion.
That is the tricky part, that everyone has a problem with these ideas of East and West. There's too many asterisks in the text of being civilization. Poland is Eastern, except for when it's not.
Yeah, well, Poland itself, as a Slavic country, had its own odd gubernatorial system, the elective monarchy, which at first glance might recall, the old tribal monarchies of the Saxons in the West, except for the part where, it wasn't majority rule. It was you had to have an absolute consensus by the end of its existence, which was pretty messy. If you think our presidential elections are bad in the United States, I'm sure that a good read-up on the history of Poland electing its kings for the last 100 years before the partitions would turn your head.
And I guess, and that's the situation you're going to find when trying to compare any pair of civilizations, because you're going to find these people that are sort of amalgamations of the two. Like, say, in the current context of these civilizations, Turkey is one of those countries that's trying somewhat to be Western, but keeps getting pulled back into its Islamic civilizational roots.
Well, it's and that's something that's going to be inescapable for Turkey as well, because the Turkish Republic, as it is now, is the direct successor to the Ottoman Empire, which was the last caliphate. That was the last monarchy that actually had the title of Commander of the Faithful for its ruler, which was both a political and a religious position. You did have monarchies that sprang up after World War I in Iraq, in Egypt, and in Jordan and Saudi Arabia. None of them could lay claim to the title of Caliph, however, and none attempted to, interestingly enough. But, by the time we do get to the end of World War I, the specter of what is East versus West does rise again urgently. But now it's in a totally different form. Islam, or organized political Islam as a threat to Europe, has generally not been a problem since the end of the 18th century, when the Ottomans were pretty much fixed on a period of extended decline, which continued throughout the 19th century as more of its Balkan territories became independent. After World War I, Britain and France divest Turkey of its Middle Eastern territories for the most part, Syria, Palestine, and Iraq. But now the Russian Revolution takes place. Communism takes control of Russia. Now you do again have this sense of East versus West, but in a totally new dimension. Now it's not so much cultural or linguistic or even religious. It's now ideological. You have Bolshevism in Russia, or now the Soviet Union, which openly says that its goal is to spread revolution by force if necessary, in a manner similar to the French Revolution before.
Yes, and that, as the one last little thing I want to point to, is that how neither of these civilizations, East and West, the ideas that sort of built them are not native to themselves. It's like how the entirety of Christendom comes from a Middle East, a non-Roman or Western religion. How the modern context of East and West, being with Russia and communism, was not an idea native to Russia. And capitalism, well, okay, unless you want to give sole credit to the invention of capitalism to a Scotsman, then it did not solely come from the West.
I think capitalism as we know it really belongs in the hands of, or credit for that would probably go to English and Dutch merchants. But, by 1917, certainly by the end of the revolution, when the Soviet Union has firmly displaced the Russian Empire in its territory, we do get kind of what's now the current sense of an East versus West boundary, or what is firmly West and firmly East. After 1917, most people don't tend to see Russia as really being part of Western civilization anymore. It's seen as being part of, the communist second world, according to the Three Worlds theory. By World War II's end, as under Stalin, the Soviet Union expands its influence westward, Churchill gives his famous Iron Curtain speech about the Iron Curtain from Stettin to Trieste, which roughly corresponds to, a Germanic or Latin West and a Slavonic East, with a few exceptions. Eastern Germany, of course, being the big one.
Right. So I guess, what are some closing thoughts we have for this idea, since we'll be able to get a lot more into this when we get to another future planned episode we have. We'll be able to get a lot more into some of these ideas. So I guess, what are some last thoughts we have now before we give away too much?
Well, I think that it's important to note that if you haven't noticed it, and of course I think we've said it a few times, is that the notion of Western civilization is two things. One, it's Western-centric first. We being Americans, of course, are going to have our own preconceptions about that. But it's also very subjective over time. The idea of the East or Eastern civilization being something other than us. That it's different, not necessarily bad, but it's different. And if you look at the world now from where it was 20 years ago, when you have the Iron Curtain speech, which distinguishes a capitalist or social democratic West from a communist East, down the middle of Europe, after the Cold War ends, the former Soviet satellite states and Soviet republics, many of which are orienting toward NATO and toward the European Union, we kind of perceive that boundary as moving eastward. In fact, some might even say that the boundary is now Russia's western frontier. But in many ways, in terms of things like fighting terrorism or other, some are more willing to include Russia as a Western power. And in many ways, its concepts of power are Western. But I think that it's important to note that one of the big weaknesses of the West versus East debate is that it's so messy when it's trying to figure out what is not West or what is East. Because in this entire conversation, we've talked about Slavonic civilizations, we've talked about Hellenism, Persia, excuse me, Islam. Sorry. We've talked about Slavonic cultures, Hellenism, and Islam. I think I mentioned India once, and there's been no real discussion about, American peoples who were their own separate groups of civilizations, and certainly not what is really the East on a Eurasian model, which is, the civilizations of China, Korea, and Japan, the Far East. And so I think it's important to really think carefully about, not only what the terms mean, but what they imply and their significance in whatever situation you're discussing them. Because, the term can change from minute to minute as it did from year to year in history. Thank you, Grant, for this great discussion. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and you did hint that we will be touching a bit more on this in future dates, but join us again next week as we talk about alternative names for historical events. That should be fun.
Oh, yes, lots.
All right, then. This has been the Casual Historian Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then give us a rating and a review on iTunes. You can also find this podcast on the Casual Historian YouTube channel. And you can follow the Casual Historian on Facebook and Twitter. And go to casualhistorian.com for more content like this. You can email any comments, questions, or business inquiries to casualhistorian@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.